All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating and honestly pretty wild piece of occult history, Dion Fortune's 1930 book, Psychic Self-Defense. This thing is basically a practical guide to a world of invisible forces that she was convinced are operating just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. And right out of the gate, Fortune makes one thing absolutely clear. For her, this was not just some theory. It wasn't speculation. This was something she lived through, something truly harrowing. So she's not just writing as an author here, she's writing as a survivor. And that personal stake is what makes this whole thing so powerful and, well, so chilling. So how did this all start for her? Well, the story kicks off when she was just 20 years old. She had a job working for a woman who, as she'd later figure out, had a deep and very practical knowledge of how to manipulate the human mind, and she wasn't afraid to use it on her own employees. It all came to a head during this one single brutal encounter. For 4 straight hours, her boss just fixed her with this intense stare and repeated 2 phrases over and over and over again. You are incompetent and you know it. You have no self-confidence and you have got to admit it. I mean, can you imagine? It was a relentless mental siege. And the aftermath? It was catastrophic. Fortune said it left her a mental and physical wreck. Her body was like a battery that had been just completely drained, and it took her 3 long years to recover. This awful experience became the driving force for the rest of her life's work. So this is Dion Fortune. She was a British occultist, a ceremonial magician, a novelist, and she took her own traumatic experience and turned it into this systematic investigation of the unseen world. She was determined to figure out exactly what had been done to her, and more importantly, how to defend against it. Which, of course, brings us to the first big question she had to tackle. How do you even know you're under an attack that you can't see? What are the signs to look for? So Fortune put together a kind of checklist of symptoms. It starts psychologically, with this pervasive sense of dread, of oppression. Then it moves into terrifying nightmares, sometimes with a very physical feeling of weight on your chest. From there, it can escalate to sudden, crippling exhaustion, strange bruises showing up on your body out of nowhere, even inexplicable evil smells, and in extreme cases, full-on poltergeist activity, objects moving or being thrown around. Now, what's so interesting is that Fortune knew the biggest problem with all this. I mean, how do you separate a genuine psychic assault from hysteria or mental illness or even just someone trying to trick you? And this is where she was surprisingly pragmatic. Her number one rule was always this: investigate every single possible natural cause first. Before you start worrying about the devil, she'd say, go look for the hysterical maidservant. Before you jump to an occult attack, get a full medical checkup. The supernatural was always the absolute last resort, never the first guess. Okay, so once you've ruled out all the natural causes, what's left? Well, this brings us to her theories on the attackers themselves. Who or what did she believe was behind these assaults? Fortune argued that the deep historical fear of witchcraft wasn't just some silly superstition. She believed it was based on centuries of bitter collective experience with people who really could wield these invisible powers to hurt others. The terror, she insisted, was rooted in reality. She basically divided the attackers into 2 main camps. First, you've got living humans, people who use stuff like hypnotic suggestion, maybe driven by some kind of vengeance from what she thought were past lives as witches. She even claimed they could project their etheric body to make physical contact. Then, on the other hand, you have non-human attackers, disembodied spirits, ghosts that are tied to a specific place, or even these beings she called elementals, which could actually be created and aimed by a human magician. And part of this whole world of psychic attacks is the idea of psychic vampirism. Fortune described this as a leakage of your vital energy. And she said sometimes it's unconscious, like a kind of psychic parasite in a really unhealthy, codependent relationship. But other times it's a deliberate, malicious draining of another person's life force. Now, this all sounds pretty fantastical, I know, but Fortune actually laid out a clear system for how she thought it all worked. She was really trying to create a kind of science of the unseen, a set of principles that govern these invisible battles. The number one weapon in their arsenal is telepathic suggestion. The idea here is that an attacker doesn't bother trying to argue with your conscious mind. They just plant a seed of an idea directly into your subconscious. And then that seed grows and eventually pops into your head as if it were your own thought, your own impulse.
It's manipulation from the inside out.
So how does an attack like that actually get through? Well, Fortune taught that we all have a natural defense system, an energy field she called the aura. An attacker can't just brute force their way through it. Here's the catch. The aura, she said, can only be pierced from the inside by our own emotional reaction. A spark of fear or a hook of desire is what opens the gate and lets the attack in. And this next story just shows how incredibly real all of this was to her. She tells this shocking story about how one time she was just stewing over some deep resentment and she accidentally created what she called an artificial elemental. Lying in that state between waking and sleeping, she focused on her anger and suddenly felt this bizarre drawing out sensation. And a fully formed wolf materialized right there beside her on the bed, created from her own energy. Okay, so that leads us to the final and, let's be honest, the most important part of this whole explainer. What did Fortune actually recommend we do for self-defense? The first line of defense is surprisingly down to earth. First, sever all contact with the attacker. Focus on your physical health, good food, fresh air, exercise, avoid drugs. She also said to stop meditating if you feel like you're under attack, because it can make you more vulnerable. And just generally ground yourself in the physical world. And once again, get a physical checkup. But then, right alongside the practical advice, you get the mystical steps. This is a ritual for creating a spiritual shield. It involves facing east, using specific hand gestures, invoking a higher power, and she blends esoteric tradition with familiar religious symbols like the sign of the cross. And finally, you literally draw a protective circle around yourself and declare that nothing bad can cross it. So the overall approach is totally holistic. It's not just about warding off evil spirits with magic. It's about making yourself a fortress, both physically and spiritually. You strengthen your body to reinforce your mind, and you strengthen your spirit to guard your soul. And all of this comes back to one of Fortune's central ideas. When she was analyzing the old story of Faust, she concluded that Margarita didn't fall because of the devil's power, but because she responded to the lure of the jewels. The weak spot, the real opening for the attack, was ultimately inside herself. And that really leaves us with a final big question to chew on. If an external attack truly has no power until we open the door from the inside with our own emotions, does that mean the ultimate defense isn't really about circles or rituals, but about achieving complete mastery over our own inner world? Definitely something to think about.